Redeemer exists to help connect Jesus to people, people to community, and community to mission. Thanks for dropping in on another Bible Talk in the Redeemer Queens Park community. I have a question for you. Which story are you living? We all have to live according to a particular story. That story has a narrator, it has a villain, it has a hero, and it has someone in need. Which story are you living your life according to? Exodus chapter 32 gives us a picture of the true story of the whole world. It's not just the story of God's people as they escaped slavery in Egypt, as they were delivered by the mighty hand of God. It's the story of you and me as well. Let's not waste any time and get right into it. The first thing we learn in the true story of the whole world is that it begins with the God who is kind, loving, and compassionate towards his people. In the book of Exodus, we learn about God who sees his people enslaved. God moves towards his people in slavery. God breaks his people out of slavery. God is the one who sets people free. It's the bedrock of the whole story. If you miss this, then you'll miss God and you'll miss out on everything else. We have to consider the God who's there, who's kind, who sees the people who can't help themselves, and he chooses to move towards that people in incredible love. Have a look at the God who is there, the God who provides everything that his people need. They need water, God gives water. They need bread, God gives bread. They need meat to eat, and God provides meat to eat. God takes care of his people. He's absolutely kind. He's absolutely loving. He meets his people's needs right, left, and center. God is kind, he's loving, and he's compassionate towards his people. That's the opening act of the true story, and have a look at what happens next. In Act 2 of the true story of the whole world, we actually see in Exodus chapter 32, verses 1 through 6, we rebel against the kind, loving, and compassionate God. Exodus 32 has it for us. Just have a look. When you get to see right here in the text, you get to see what we do with this loving God. Come, make us gods who will go before us, is what the people say. As for this fellow Moses who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. So they commissioned Aaron, one of the leaders of their people, who took what was handed to him and made an idol, cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods who brought you out of Egypt." This is what we do. We take the kind, loving, compassionate God, and when he is absent from us for a few moments, when we just have a few moments of forgetting who he is and how good he's been to us, we say, you know what, we'll just turn to other gods. It's the true story of the whole world. This is what we do. And it's not just what God's people did as God's people were broken out of captivity in Egypt. This is our story today. This is how we respond to God. A little bit of failing, a little bit of forgetfulness, and we turn to gods of comfort. The Bible calls these idols. When we take anything in our lives and we make it the great thing that we're going to live our lives around, the Bible calls this an idol. We worship it. We set up our attention, our affection, our devotion around things that are not God. But listen, they'll never satisfy us because God is the foundation of this story. We were made to live in his presence. There's nothing else that will do. We desperately need this God. Well, our rebellion against God is a rebellion against a good and gracious God. We got to kind of keep this in mind because sometimes today we can actually see rebellion as a good thing. And there's times when rebellion is a good thing. Let's overthrow the man. Let's stand up to oppression. But this isn't rebellion in that sense. This is us taking the kind, loving, and compassionate God and choosing our own way instead of his. Now, Act 2, Scene 2, we not only rebel against this God, but we blame shift and we justify the nature of our rebellion. That's exactly what Exodus teaches us. When you have a look a little further into the text, you get to see that God's people, we don't simply rebel and turn our backs on God. we act like we're entirely just for doing it. We see this in Aaron. You can notice in verses 21 to 25. He's saying, well, you know how prone these people are to evil. Verse 24, they gave me this gold, and out of it just popped out of a fire. This calf just came out. I mean, it sounds like Aaron is in middle school, or he's in secondary school. I mean, we've all met the kid, right? God's looking at these people. He's like, what in the world's going on? Moses goes to confront Aaron, and when he's talking to Aaron, Aaron's like, I don't know what happened. We just took off the gold and we threw it into the fire, and out popped this calf. He's justifying. He's blame shifting. And you know what was particularly treasonous about this action is that God's people, they took the very gold that God gave them as a wedding gift when he broke them out of slavery in Egypt, and they used that to make an idol. To illustrate, as graphic as this might be, imagine a spouse going on the honeymoon and hawking the wedding band in order to get a night with someone else. That's what God's people are doing. And this is the true story of the whole world. It begins with the kind, loving, compassionate God. And we all rebel against him in many ways. We forget his presence, and we think there's an absence, and we just turn to other gods. We turn to other people, and we turn to other things. When we're trying to be held accountable for our rebellion, we justify and we blame shift. And Act 3 is where things get really serious. Because of this, because God's people made in his image, they rebel against God, God judges man. And he's just to do so. He is entirely just to judge man. We see this starting to take place in Exodus chapter 32, verses 7 through 10. God responds to our rebellion with just wrath. You see in verse 10, God says, now leave me alone, that my anger may burn against them, and I may destroy them. Now this is super woke 2021. We're not supposed to talk about things like wrath. We're not supposed to talk about things like God and accountability. But this is the true story of the whole world, and it must be proclaimed as public truth. God hates sin, and he is just to do so. If God did not hate sin, he would not be the Most High. But God, who is so full of love, you'll remember, he's kind, he's compassionate, he's loving with the world. When people who are made in his image, when they turn their back on him, God is moved. And he would not be a good God if he was not moved. Yeah, he's not like the golden calf that people hawked their wedding bands for, cast into a fire and made this idol to worship. An idol that couldn't hold them accountable, a idol that couldn't guide them, and a idol that was totally useless to them. Yeah, God's different than that. God's going to hold his people accountable, and he's going to guide. And this is where verses 7, 8, 9, and 10, God does judge people in their sin. But remember, this is part of the unchanging perfections in the character of God. God is perfectly holy. He is perfectly just, and his holiness never changes. His justice never changes, and his wrath never changes. So think about the tension that Exodus 32 gives us. We are met with a God who has wrath that is dead set against sin. And yet, beautifully, we got to feel what's on offer here. Because God has promised to bless this people. God has promised to take care of this people. God has promised to be good to this people. But this people is undeserving. This people has sin. This people doesn't deserve the kindness of God. They don't deserve the compassion of God. They don't deserve the love of God. So what is God going to do? Well, beautifully, in Act 4 of the true story of the whole world, God sets up a mediator to work out the relationship between him and his people. But the question that dominates this text of Scripture is, how can a God who is holy and who is just. How can he love this people that does not deserve his love? And the answer is that God provides a mediator. God raises up this man named Moses, this compassionate one who is going to stand between God and his wrath and a people who he's promised to bless. Moses is this mediator, this person who's set up as the go-between between two parties. This is the one who is going to stand in the gap between the people and God. And there goes Moses. Moses climbs up the mountain. Moses tells the people, perhaps I can atone for your sin. And Moses stands there on behalf of God and on behalf of the people. He mediates the picture. God had provided him there for a reason, because the reality is that God in his holiness most assuredly will demonstrate his wrath on sin amidst the disobedient people. And he is going to do it through a mediator that's going to stand in between them. I wonder how Moses got there. I wonder if Moses had time encountering God in the fire, thinking about who God is, and just thinking, you know what? I bet this God would be willing to transfer the sins of a people to another. Perhaps I can go. Perhaps I can make a way. And Moses offers himself to be the mediator. Moses pleads with God, God, if you're going to take them out, you might as well take me out instead. He offers himself. But Moses is an imperfect substitute for undeserving people, because even Moses has sin in his life. Even Moses is unfit to perfectly stand in the gap between the people and God. And absolutely beautifully, what we see in Act 5 of the true story of the whole world is that God, in his incredible kindness and compassion towards the world, he chooses to display his mercy. We reject God and his word. We replace God with other things. We justify our actions as right. And God just continues to move towards his people. God establishes a mediator to stand in the gap. And then God works through that mediator to show undeserved mercy to his people. Mercy being the idea that he holds back the punishment that we deserve. Grace being the idea that he gives us what we don't deserve in our place. Why? We go back to the bedrock of the whole story. It's because God is kind, God is compassionate, and God is loving. And he has good intentions for his people. Even though his people turn their backs on him, turn to other things, justify and blame shift the terms of their disobedience, God has a better plan. Moses is a picture of Jesus. Moses is the one who stands in the gap between God and people. He leads us to Jesus. Jesus, the perfect mediator, who stood in the gap between the people and God. And just as God tells us in Romans chapter 3, verses 25 to 26, God is a God of wrath, and God saves his wrath. He holds his wrath so he can get to the cross of Christ and he can pour it out all on his Son. The wrath of God is incredibly misunderstood. He's so full of kindness and compassion and love. He will punish sin, and he offers to punish it all through Jesus Christ. He looks at a whole nation of people in need, and he says, come to me, as he makes provision for sin. So what does this leave us with? Well, it leaves us at the end of the true story of the whole world having to face a question. Who's narrating the story of our lives? Who's the hero of each of our stories? And how about the offer of the story that God provides? God offers Jesus as this mediator of mercy, where God is going to make things right with his people if we'll only believe in him. You know, just one thing needs to be said at the end of this story. As we get to see Moses as this go-between between God and people, even Moses is unfit. And when we think about this new church community that's coming together in Northwest London, we even think about the pastors and the leaders like myself and Daniel and others that are leading the way. Moses was an imperfect substitute and an imperfect mediator. I'm an imperfect leader as well. Only Jesus won't fail. So build your Christianity and build your life, not on me as a pastor, not on a few people leading the way at Redeemer, not even on the church. Build it all on Jesus and allow Jesus to be enough for you.